Hey yo, what is up everyone? It is the Alpha J of the Alpha J Show, and I'm getting very creative with these titles, aren't I? And no, I'm not making an analogy or anything, it's just a title. Thought I should point that out. The last time I talked about Family Guy, it was about how their format of being very offensive, very confused, and very perverted, with more cutaways than actual substance, made it next to impossible for them to accomplish the concept that they were trying to do. I personally would like to believe that I don't get offended as much as the common viewer, especially towards Family Guy. And it's not because it's a cartoon, it's just that it's been going on for years, and like I said before, they don't really mean it. But the rude, offensive, and the plain stupid had a charm at one point, right? Well, let's find out as I review Running Mates. So we start off with Stewie being a baby and eating dirt with his teddy bear. We have Lois being a mother and stopping him from being reckless. Then we have Quagmire being a friend and helping out Lois while she puts down signs aiding in her school board run. Notice a pattern here? The characters are acting more like actual human beings and not the monsters they will later become.
She actually opposes background checks for new teachers. God knows who she might hire.
Making the sides opposite, both of the acute angles, A and B, will always equal the sum of the squares of the other sides. Any questions?
Yes, perverted. Yes, offensive. But no, not inappropriate. A cutaway that makes sense. And that's pretty interesting. I'm going to be comparing this episode to the other episode I reviewed, which is later in the series of Family Guy. So if you haven't seen it, it's a good video to watch and you'll understand a lot more of the comparisons I will be making. So in that episode, they had a cutaway revolving around birds pressing their butts to the window, Peter selling fish, and Peter asking kids on the block if they're new because he had a toothpick. What does any of that have to do with the main plot of Quagmire and Peter fighting over a crocodile confession? Nothing, at least on the surface level, because sure, they could have pulled it off with good writing, but later Family Guy isn't the best with his writing. So as Stewie listens to Lois explain her concerns, she says that even if she's gone from the house more, she's willing to be a part of the school board. Peter comes out and makes some jokes, but more importantly, he sets up the narrative that he's not really listening to Lois. And I like this opening because it has a lot of solid jokes and it seems to keep close to the story. Also, the jokes that it tell relate to the story. So Brian gets a call about Chris peeping in the women's locker room, and this will come into play later. They talk about it and Peter runs into his old teacher. They try to have a conversation, but unfortunately, his teacher seems very different. He seems not to be in the same reality as the rest of the people in the school. His name is Mr. Fargan and he has to use these pills to balance out his crazy behavior. And I don't want to spoil it, even for a popular but older episode like this. I just like to say that older Family Guy really took the time to make sure that you can rewatch this when you're older and really appreciate some of the more subtle jokes. You can parallel this to early SpongeBob, Animaniacs, and the cartoons of the previous millennium. So Peter decides to have his former teacher not take the pills and teach in a way that he recalls that he did. Mind you, we do see things from rose-colored glasses, or the more layman's way of saying it, nostalgia. Isn't that right, the Mighty B? Remember a short while ago when I said that Chris peeping into the women's locker room will come into play? Well, Peter gives Chris magazines to use. So again, put a pin in that. It'll come into play later. This is also a very good joke that again, I will not spoil. So let's move on. As Lois continues to prepare items for their election, Mr. Fargan appears on TV, throwing eggs of an endangered species off the school roof with his students.
Oh my God, he's gonna wipe that species off the face of the earth.
No, Lois, the janitor will do that.
This Peter Griffin. I want to see this Peter Griffin. Here's the thing, I understand that the blatant jokes have their place. The general public really doesn't want to think about their comedy. Not only that, but it's easier to write and connect with your audience. However, the role of a subtle joke usually goes farther, despite not connecting as direct. I know I get a new perspective watching an older cartoon and thinking about the subtle or even adult jokes. So due to Mr. Fargan doing this crazy stunt, he's fired immediately. Why they chose to fire him but not stop the extinction of the eggs is beyond me. That's like taking out an arsonist but keeping the fire untouched. In unrelated news, Betsy LeBeau, the candidate that Lois was running against, drops out of the race because convenience. So now Lois is running unopposed. That also means she would be fully capable of giving Mr. Fargan back his job, correct? Well, she decides to agree with the board's decision and not oppose the removal of Mr. Fargan.
I know, you're a feminist, and I think that's adorable, but this is grown-up time, and I'm the man.
There's so many options I can take here. I can fully agree, then go full on social justice warrior mode. I can be really edgy and make an offensive joke for shock value, or it can go down the middle road and try to pander to as many of my fans as possible. But I think I'll take not caring enough to be witty, but caring enough to pointing it out. The luxury of being a YouTuber. Honestly, this seems in character for Peter and gives him a reasonable foundation for the future conflict. This is actually what gives adult cartoons a greater distinction from their strictly aimed for young audiences counterpart. A children's show can get away with having a villain have no reason for what he does. Why does insert villain name here want to rob the bank? Because he's evil. Why is he evil? Because screw you, that's why. Adult animation tends to show why the antagonist is the antagonist. Now, this isn't to say that children's shows don't show the antagonist reasons for doing what they do, it's just not required. So Peter decides to run against Lois, which both Lois and Brian give their disapproval of. One thing I do have to say is that later down this episode, the frequent cutaway gags and the longer montages do pad out the episode. Now, like I said in this Family Guy review, when you do go back to cutaway gags, it just makes your episode look like it's stalling for time, especially when the cutaway gags don't really relate to the episode's concept, in my opinion. Short answer, the following montage of both candidates running their campaign is solid, nothing to highlight, but not long enough to really criticize. There is a subplot with Brian and Stewie, but it's more character development than anything else. We find Peter running his campaign to a town heavily in favor of his wife Lois. He would explain that it's all about the debate. I should stop and open the pin from before. So the magazines given to Chris from a long time ago, those are then introduced to his friends, as a replacement for rocks that look like breasts. But let's move on to the debate. I'd like to point out that this is another joke that went under my nose the first time I viewed it, but when I actually read it, it's another joke that does require a little bit of thought. But I'd like to think that my audience gets it immediately. But my audience isn't representative of Family Guy's demographic, so you might as well put those comments away. During the debate, it is clear that Peter is not only underprepared, but not taking it seriously. I don't want to explicitly inject any political commentary into this clearly political episode, but this sounds like I've heard this duo before. I can't really put my finger on it. I like the comedy they put into the debate. It's really spot on for early Family Guy episodes, although there are a few problems that linger throughout the episode, such as the poor animation and the dependency on mostly irrelevant cutaway gags. I can counterbalance that with the sharp control of a greater balance of direct and subtle humor, as well as the performances of both Peter and Lois.
What kind of future will it be if you elect a man who has never taught a student to even been to a PTA meeting? I'm the right person for the job. Vote for me.
This was a part of the original character of Lois. Granted, it isn't the best speech, but it gets the point across in a very impressive way. The speech causes the entire audience, mediators included, to be in favor of Lois. A victory later, we get to see how nasty the competition can get. Remember that photo that Peter accidentally forgot to take out of the box of magazines that he was giving to Chris? Well, he uses that photo to put Lois' campaign to an abrupt end. This causes Peter to win by a landslide, and obviously Lois isn't too happy about this. And we as an audience can sympathize with her, losing a campaign that she was really invested in to a person who only ran to keep his teacher working. Both Lois and Peter get into a quarrel over it, and this somehow gets Peter to turn around and do a good job. They never really explain how he got all these changes done in this politically charged episode. They never mention budget or money, which is a heavy factor into why we as a society, or Quahog as a society, can't get everything we want at once. It is assumed that anything can work in a budget, like someone put cheat codes in for extra money. I did not take this into account. It's just interesting that they leave out probably what is one of the top 3 most important things that goes into a decision with the amount of importance as something like this. So as Peter goes around showing the vast improvements he has made to the school, it all comes around full circle as the children in the library are reading adult magazines. And I'm sorry, but I cannot suspend my disbelief for this. You're telling me that these kids made reading adult magazines in public commonplace. This may be the unpopular opinion, but I'm gonna call contrived on this one. They link the magazines back to Chris, who associates them with Peter. All of this brings out a huge scandal, which Quagmire and his friend here recommend to Peter that he lies and he puts the blame on Lois. I do like this moment here, however. Unlike many shows, they don't really show the moment where the antagonist isn't really a bad, evil guy. He's just a normal person with their own beliefs, morals, and principles. So as he begins his speech, his own morals get into the way.
Look, my wife Lois is the most important person in the world to me. I gave my son those magazines. Even worse, I turned a beautiful gift from Lois into something cheap and tawdry. Lois, I only hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me.
Again, not speech of the year, but nothing to sleep on. This is all concluded with Lois and Peter making up, Peter's resignation, and the end of the episode. This episode is actually pretty good. It obviously shows that at one time, Family Guy was witty, funny, and yes, adult. I do genuinely enjoy this episode despite its faults. I quite like the performance of Peter. He isn't doing it just because. The plotline with Stewie and Brian, while not really necessary, doesn't take up too much time out of the episode, and some parts can be pretty funny to certain people. I do enjoy that at one time Family Guy wasn't as brute or as loud as it is today. Not that brute or loud humor doesn't work, but as adult animation can show, the route nowadays doesn't really offer too much that we haven't seen before. This episode's animation was very stilted at times, like the Mighty Bee and early King of the Hill, but again, I can handwave this because the story was actually pretty great. So join me next time when I rewrite Squid Baby. As always, I hope your time was well spent, and Alpha out.